I'll be presenting. I make part of the Bolivia Commission, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you in the framework of sustainability, in the framework of the fifth meeting in Latin America and the Caribbean about sustainable development that began this morning and that we organized as part of the coalition about financing for the development of the collaboration platform regionally in Latin America and the Caribbean from United Nations. Many platforms and many coordination, but what we'll be talking about today is how we can, through finance strategies, find better results to improve gender equality. We have a great panel. In particular, I would like to welcome Mayor of Bogotá, Claudia López, and Marcelo Alessandro, works from the Economy Ministry in Argentina, that from their own roles and visions will be sharing very important experiences about how we can board our growing needs to implement economic and social policies focused on gender, and that at the same time can contribute to the transformation of gender equality. We are honored by Luis Felipe López Calvo, Subsecretary of United Nations and Regional Director of the Program for Development, and the Executive Secretary for the CEPAL, Mariano Baeza, a pleasure, Regional Director of Caribbean and Latin America for Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women, and Igualdad Garcia, Director of the Gender section of CEPAL. We greet Daniel Bitterman of Economic Development and the co-chair of this coalition. We also thank the governor of Mexico Central in Mexico that unfortunately at the last moment wasn't able to join us today, but nonetheless, we will find the opportunity of inviting them to future conversations on this topic. Moving forward with this today, it is more urgent than ever. We heard this morning and we'll continue to speak about this reality. Important commitments to increase the resources and investment that lead to decreasing the gender inequalities and to be able to achieve our goals. In this context today, we want to have this conversation. We want to know and share experiences at the level of Latin America and the Caribbean to improve the transformation and recovery based on gender equality and opportunities for women in the long term. Without further ado, I'll give the microphone on to Luis Felipe López Calvo, which will be offering us a scenario view. He leads the work and the teams in Peru in 40 different countries and regions of the world, supporting the efforts of the government, civil society sector, and the private sector to be able to reach the goals of sustainable development for 2030. He has 30 years experience working in academia, working with governments in the region and multilateral organizations, recently in the World Bank as well. Luis Felipe. Thank you very much, Luciana. Welcome all of you. Thank you all very much for being present in this meeting, which shows the importance of this topic and the discussion corresponding to it. First of all, I would like to greet our guests, Claudia López, the Mayor of Bogotá, Marcelo Alessandro, working from the Ministry of Economy in Argentina, and of course, our colleague of many of these tasks, Mariano Baeza, Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean of UNDP and ONU Women. Very special welcome to Alicia Barcelona of CEPAL, which will be giving us a message through a video. Also, others from CEPAL as well present here today. also the people behind this technical work in this coalition, which are Luciana Bernet and Daniel Bitterman from CEPAL. Obviously, I would like to mention about the work of United Nations at a regional level is organized in a platform that we call the Regional Collaboration Platform, where we have all the different platforms and the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, co-led by CEPAL and PNUD, or the UNDP. And this meeting annually is presided by the chair of the regional platforms, Alina Mohano. And in this context, we are speaking about this initiative from a coalition about the financing for development. And of course, the date of March 11th. And as well, tomorrow we'll be focusing on this important subject. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you to this panel. Today we'll be speaking about financing for development as a fundamental vehicle in our region in Latin America and the Caribbean to mobilize the necessary resources and rescue the path towards the sustainable development goals in such a complex context at a regional level. In 2020 in the region, this was the region where the highest impact, and this contraction, there was heterogeneity, particularly affecting women. The recovery of this crisis must take into account inclusion policies that respond to the growing inequality, the loss of the achievements that had been gained, and the inflation problems, as well as the geopolitical crisis. And these are the main challenges that we find in our region. Within this context, as a group of United Nations at a regional level, we are convinced that the financing for development is one of the instruments, one of the engines, fundamental engines, to be able to speak about a sustainable and inclusive recovery. And for this, the collaborative platform at a regional level has been proposed after we define these goals for development. If there is one message that I would like to leave in this intervention, is the sustainable development and recovery requires more investment in women and more investment from women. Gender equality is a main objective. Sustainable development will be more thorough. It is very important to think not only in the investment and everything that affects economic opportunities of women, but also open these spaces for the women to be part of this recovery, having access to all these different opportunities. For example, the report of women, companies, and rights that is published every year speaks about having more equality in the access to opportunities for women. Thousands or millions of women don't have the same rights as women as the law goes, showing the discrimination that law has having to do with work, pay, marriage, employment, assets. The report shows that women in general have an index of 75% of achievements with respect to men, basically 1/4 of a gap that's being shown in this index. This gap is also being deepened by the pandemic. The levels that we see have not been seen in years before in terms of participation and work opportunities. Work opportunities and participation dropped to almost half of what we had in the levels pre-pandemic. This shows structural discrimination that remain practically the same. And at the same time, the chronic deficit in the investment of gender equality makes it even harder to face these challenges to close these gaps in the region. And making use of these financial and tax laws are necessary to make use of these advantages, and making use of information and gender equality to be able to understand how these policies influence the way that they are being boarded. And we also know that the financing is a primary engine for the social and economic development. And this is basically the fuel that allows the engine to work. And there are many obstacles in this sense. Not only that women are receptors of this investment, but that women have better opportunities to make use of their ability to work, ability to save these resources, physical capital as well, to be able to own land, for example, in their home, so they can use this as collateral to obtain a loan or financial services. And here in Costa Rica as well, we have seen cases of leadership at a global level where the protection is being used at a gender focus. And these women communities are the ones that are protecting, for example, the statutes, and this generates an income to be able to keep advancing in their life plans. It's very important then to combine these issues. The matter of financing for development not only is investing in women, but women also invest in development. Our emblematic initiative, we have designed a group of standards for the financial standards and development, offering services of investment and the management of private funds, and collaboration with many other agencies of the UN to support gender programs and budget processes. As part of this, we support, for example, the first mission of sovereign bonds for the management of sustainable development goals in Mexico, and recollection of $190 million in their first emission and 1,200 in a second emission. We have also supported an alliance with governments of the country, certification of more than 1,000 companies with the seal of gender equality, impacting more than 1.5 million workers in different industries, including mines, industry, energy. As well, we have identified ourselves with a methodology of maps of investment, 94 opportunities in Brazil, Belize, Costa Rica, Paraguay, and Colombia. And a lot of these opportunities will aim towards advancing significantly in the generation of opportunities for women. We also support this for the technical follow-up with these development of these programs. For example, in Colombia, we developed chains of agricultural processes such as avocados, financing these processes through seed capital credits and groups where we benefited more than 3,500 people in rural region, 70% of them women. To close, it's very important to reiterate that the offers and the bets of our projects try to expand our processes in these borders with other agencies for Latin America and the Caribbean to advance in the impact in financial instruments with gender focus and the implementation of strategies of transversality and tax and to be able to finance a digital transformation that is considered central for women. With this, I would like to conclude my intervention trying to challenge the chronic deficit of investment in women and from women. And there's no doubt for a just, inclusive recovery in the post-pandemic will require more strategic investments, private capitals that complement those that are public with innovative instruments for financing, more oriented towards structural barriers for women in the labor market and the access to other assets, and with connections in the advance of equality in the agenda for 2030. I would like to close by saying that you can continue to count with the UNDP and the system of the United Nations in this path.
Thank you so much, Director. Your words, your opening remarks were very important. We're going to listen to Alicia Barcelona, who's going to give us some opening remarks. She is now the Director for Latin America for CEPAL, and since June 2008, and we also have other members for the UN in New York. We also have the cabinet of the Secretariat from Kofi Annan's office. Thank you. Dear colleagues from the system of the UN, dear Mr. Felipe Lopez Cala, the Director, Regional Director for UNDP for Development, Latin America and the Caribbean, and also the Director of Latin America and the Caribbean from UN Women, Victoria Rodriguez, the Governor of the Bank of Mexico, Mercedes Alexandra, the National Director of Equality and Gender from the Republic of Argentina, and Claudia Lopez, the Mayor of Bogota in Colombia. It's truly a pleasure for me to give opening remarks regarding this event of financing for the gender equality. And this is one of 5 events for Latin America and the Caribbean in development. And this opportunity is so important to look at the different styles of development that are so important. The pandemic has developed a crisis that has been the greatest crisis of our region. We know that the GDP fell 6.8%, the highest contraction in the last decades, and growth for 2021, which is 6.2, is not enough of growth to counteract the high drop we had in 2020. So it limits the access to funding and capital markets, and a very reduced fiscal space, exposure and vulnerability to market crisis, changing prices. And we have a market that has low rates of innovation and commerce and trade that can drive supply chains and productive chains to drive growth. The COVID-19 crisis has also exacerbated gender inequality. From CEPAL, we're seeing this huge loss of jobs for women. We've seen high rates of responsibility in care, in the industry of care, that is not being paid back and is not creating revenue for women. We're also seeing the impact on women that the economy is having, especially in decision making. We're seeing a tax policy that might help to shield the impact that's being had on women. We're also looking at the reiteration of economies to recover equality. We know that tax policies are neutral, and it's hard for them to deal with the inequality of gender. We're seeing that budgeting and other things affect the distribution of income, and economic funding. We're also seeing mobilization of resources to fund policies focused on gender equality are limited. When there's an absence of these macroeconomic policies for gender equality based on the demands from the pandemic, women are always the ones receiving the shock, the main shock. From CEPAL, we're seeing that the policies of public expenditure through the transfer rates between countries has been the mechanisms that has had the best impact to help this situation of the impact of the economy. We're also seeing how it helps buffer the drops of GDP. In 2021, we've seen a trend of reducing tax services, increasing public debt, and contracting the primary expenditure and the emergency programs for the pandemic. So in 2020, the social packages and measures implied very high public expenditure, 24.7% of the GDP. However, in 2021, this was reduced to 23.6% of the GDP. And although these measures help to buffer the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic, it also manifested the structural character of the inequality in the region and women's exposure to this impact, women's involvement in the workforce dropped at 7.7%. In 2021, we see a recovery, but we see that 1 out of every 2 women are not included in the workforce. And unemployment is affected 11.8% of women, 3.7% more than unemployment for men. So it's very important to focus on these sectors that were the most hard hit by the loss of jobs, and that certainly affect women, such as tourism, manufacturing, trade, and care industries that are not paid, especially in small and medium-sized enterprises. Hence, there's a depression in trade and commerce, and that's where we have to place main focus. Friends, such as we've seen in this crisis, the instrument of public policies is very important, focusing on gender equality. Hence, we have to continue discussing how we're going to approach inequality and how this has been aggravated by the pandemic, and also deal with the asymmetries and wealth distribution that creates these huge gaps that we are taking on for the region. Data shows us that 104 people in the region have about 11% of the productivity. That can't be true. We have to make progress in redistribution of taxation policy. So the region is going to deaccelerate its growth. So to mitigate the effects of the crisis, it's key that government will drive transformational policies that can transform economy for women and will incentivize financial inclusion of women. Many countries in the region have made an effort to make the budget more open in regards to these policies. In Colombia, for example, there's an emblematic focus by the mayor's office of Bogota. In less than 2 years, Bogota has focused certain budgets for 7 care units, and these are countries that are making progress. We've also looked at censuses and emergency efforts, such as Costa Rica with their bonuses, and Argentina, that are including infrastructure of care in their policies and how it's a key factor for gender equality. It's a strategic view on expenditure and to protect the income and jobs for women. It's indispensable to focus on these programs with synergy and focusing on equality and the economic dimension. It's very important to focus on the intensive factors in employment and incorporate universality and economic support for social protection measures. It's important to acknowledge the economy of care as a development factor for several countries and nations. We have to invest in them. We have to strengthen and create more robust systems and create co-responsibility. Friends, overcoming this social crisis requires a new social pact on the midterm. It will increase gender equality, that will combat tax increases, and also place to the forefront public expenditure, and also change the model of development and change the tax burden on those who have been taxed and who have faced the brunt of this crisis with green benefits and taxation and others. Nationally, we can't just do the minimum. We have to have a transnational effort for gender equality to correct the asymmetries that have been achieved through cooperation, especially in taxation and funding. And national and international cooperation is a key factor for growth. The region needs to reopen its conversation, for example, in the other mechanisms of redistribution and growth facing these debts that are growing and growing. We need to have the relief of debts, and governments within this regional conference for Latin America and the Caribbean need to have more funding for affirmative actions and systems that will achieve more strengthening of international cooperation. So far, we believe that international financial architecture needs to be reformed to close these gaps and guarantee for the countries of the region to have the conditions, have access to favorable conditions. And this way we can close the funding gaps and implement policies for gender equality. From CEPA, we reiterate our intention to create a new tax pact for gender equality that will ensure key policies for women, drive tax issues, and reform. We call on more participation and for different sectors to participate where there is main participation from women or by women for sustainability, and also strengthen recovery plans for general systems for care and create formal jobs that will enable more participation of women in strategic sectors of the economy. The truth is we try to recover and close the gaps of division in gender and achieve the goal of living in societies that have sustainability at their forefront. That's our goal, achieving equality, care for people, the planet, and everyone, women and men. We cannot wait any longer. The time is now. Thank you for these interventions. These are wonderful points of reference for the discussion. Luis Felipe Lopez Calva and Alicia Barcelona from the UN for the region that can strengthen the role of the UN in its support to the countries in our region. Hence, we're going to now open to different remarks and conversation, leaders in our region, And we want to thank the mayor of Bogota and the director of Ministry of Economy in Argentina for being here with us today. We're going to have our first panelist, Claudia Lopez. We're going to give each of you 15 minutes to answer specific questions. And then we have our speaker of honor who will follow. The important thing here is to focus on the comments that were stated by Luis Felipe Lopez Calva and Alicia Barcelona. We also have the mayor, Claudia Lopez, who has an incredible background. It's very difficult to sum it up here, but she was leader of the communal action in Bogota, professor, consultant of many international organizations. And she promoted very important frameworks for women, for domestic employment, and other things. So she was one of the leaders of the anti-corruption, anti-fraud board, and she also won the mayorship in Bogota, the first woman to take on this position. We are honored to have you with us. We're going to let you give your opening remarks. Do you have good sound? Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Friends, you and Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, Alicia Barcelona, thank you so much for discussing these important topics with us. We know you have a packed agenda, so thank you so much for taking the time. The district system of Bogota is an experience that has been mentioned previously. It has been quite novel for the region. We've gone over certain papers, we've reviewed much of your studies. We would like for today's discussion, if you could share some of the design efforts and how have you improved the security in Bogota and how have you designed sustainability based on this, based on the factor that we've discussed, the gender factor, and also how can we take from your lessons learned for other situations, other countries, how can they learn from you? Which is not just a municipal or a small pilot project, but it's based on a whole effort by a large city. Yes, thank you. Very generous intro, and it's always a pleasure to learn from you, to be with you and opening these discussions, which are truly constructive. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in Bogota and the context and why in 2019 I decided to launch myself to public office and why we wanted to shift from the local community work to the whole district. And it also applies to the rest of Latin America. I believe that half of our economies in Latin America and our large capital cities have an informal workforce. The workers in our cities don't have social security, they don't have pension funds, they don't have insurance for retirement or for illness. Unfortunately, we all get sick and we're always either children or we become elderly. So social security for informal work in Latin America affects women. The non-funded or non-paid work is almost half of the social security of Latin America for women. So imagine this, the poverty affecting women and poverty towards women is filling the gap of the fact that we don't have social security prevention measures either nationally, locally, for almost half of the population. So this burden of care that's unpaid, care services that are unpaid, is one of the things that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. We're seeing autonomy of education, etc. Women who have access to education. In the case of Colombia, there are more women who were able to go through their professional careers, their professional studies, technical or professional careers. But this exacerbated with all the inequality in education from elementary, high school, and more, really prevents many women from entering the formal workforce. The pandemic really made the progress that we had seen in women in the workforce go back. And so many of the women that were in the workforce had to retire from the workforce due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the pandemic really exacerbated these gaps. Gaps that were already being closed were opened again.
I was very aware of what's happening. I'm not working at a national level. I cannot work on a social security system, which would be ideal, but Colombia has a series of measures that are well-intentioned, but very perverse. In Colombia, for example, we cannot pay towards our pension under minimum wage, and half of the population, which is in the informal market, earns less than minimum wage. So then they cannot even pay towards their retirement because it's over the wage they earn. So this has generated, let's say, a discrimination in general of the informal population, and in particular women, to have some sort of social security. Just to mention one of the things that we need to fix, it's at a national level. As a senator, I tried to make it recognized. Cecilia Lopez Montalvo was really a wonderful woman in Colombia, and as a senator in Congress, managed to recognize and to measure for the first time the economy of care in Colombia. And this indicates that we're at least 20% of the GDP. If women are recognized for this 20% of the GDP, this would be quite significant. But this is not recognized. This is the small amount of the debt. So what can we do from the mayor's office is what I thought in 2019 before knowing of the pandemic and all this. But what we can do is to reorganize our health services. Bogota in Colombia is one of the countries that has better decentralization compared to other countries. In Colombia, the local mayor's office in Colombia are in charge of the most vulnerable. We're in charge of health services. We're sanitary agencies. We're also in charge of educational services from first childhood stages up to high school. But all these services are thought of in service of children, never women. We cannot think what are the hours that we should work with in women, for example, for women that work at night and that need children to somebody to take care of their children at night. The majority of women informally work at night. They work at different rates. They work on the weekends. If these centers are not open for them, then they're useless. There's 1.2 million women. Bogota has 8 million people, and 52% are women, a little bit over 4 million. 1.2 are women that have sacrificed their life, their education, that have not really finished their education because they are in the care industry. They take care of their families and their lives. And this lack of autonomy is linked to a life more exposed to violence. So this is a vicious cycle. How can we go back to a virtuous cycle? The District Center for Care is a reorganization of all the infrastructure and social services of the district for them to be in the service of women, not only kids or young children, but women. The district system of care has changed hours at services in such a way that all these services of social inclusion, recreation, education, of care for these young children and the elderly serve for that 1.2 million women in Colombia can get some rest. There's basically slaves in their homes. They don't have a Sunday that's free because they're always taking care of somebody else and nobody helps them. Secondly, in that free time, aside from resting, women can get educated. They can finish their high school or get access to post-high school education. Third service is that women can generate income through an employability route or an entrepreneurship. And this is focalized on women that have a low educational level, focalized on women that are caretakers with low educational levels that cannot leave their homes all the time. We have to understand that this is the condition of this 1.2 million women. So we can generate employment and entrepreneurship situations, understanding the circumstances, because otherwise we cannot meet the offer with the demand. This has led us to be UN Women in Colombia. This has led us to change our services. Our services begin at 6 in the morning, many of them up to 10 at night. Many of them work on weekends because this is what women and caretakers need, because we work 8 to 5, that's not enough for them. The same educational infrastructure that we used to make use for children in the same schools after the hours the children used, we reorganize these classrooms. For some of these classrooms, we can take care of children or the elderly or the people with disability in charge of these women. We take care of them for them, and at the same time, they can finish their high school, get their high school diploma, or get the education they want. Nonetheless, we find that many of these women, and this is why we mention these blocks of care, the super blocks of Barcelona is very well-known concept. In Barcelona, this is management of public space to privilege and pacify traffic and to improve co-living. In the case of Bogota, these blocks of care are blocks that not only improve public spaces, but articulate the different centers, the schools, education, parks, cultural centers, to offer these services of rest, education, of entrepreneurship routes, employability routes, and cultural transformation. Maybe the most important for us to have real cultural transformation, the cultural essence of this is machismo. In Colombia is the lack of formality, the lack of existence of social security that recognizes care, but machismo is the cultural essence of this inequality towards women. And that's why the fourth system, the fourth service of the district care in Bogota is cultural transformation. As we tell the women and men in Bogota, we learn to take care. Women don't do this innately. We learn to do a lot of things. Well, you're all welcome to learn. So the fourth service is literally to put an apron on these men and to teach them that to take care of their homes doesn't take away from their masculinity, that we need to build upon these new masculinity levels, and that family is the first ring where we need to redistribute the overcharge of paid for care. The second ring is the infrastructures and networks of the district. And the third should be the national system and the private sector. Slowly, the private sector has been involved. And the fifth service comes from this cultural transformation, and that is also teaching women that they are not obliged to take care of others. They're not obliged. But they also have a right to have a life free of violence, to recognize the signals. And we always tell them, if you're victims of violence, take the first step and we will follow you to take the second. We'll not leave you alone. The person that will hit you one time will hit you again. And all these cases of violence are reiterative. This is not normal. Humiliation, psychological aggression, economic humiliation, or even physical violence is not normal. If it happens one time, it will happen again. So the fifth service is education and new principles of self-care, prevention of violence, identifying the signals for risk on time to go to the care system on time. When I came here, there was a purple line of the Secretariat of Women to meet this woman, and 65% of the calls that came in were not answered because we did not have the personnel or the staff. Now we have multiplied this by 4 to be able to answer these calls and to help these women in need, because they arrive at hospitals because they have just been raped or violently hit. So we work with lawyers and psychologists at the hospitals directly. So if women get to the hospital in a situation of vulnerability, they're not only protected, but at the same time, they're advised psychologically and legally for these people not to fall out of the range of the law. One of these women violently hit in our countries, re-victimized constantly. They need to go to the hospital and tell what happened. When they get out of the hospital, they need to go to another place to legally take action. Then they need to go to another public building and deal with the situation again in the Attorney General's office. And then they tell them they need to go to legal medicine office. So it's a 5th public institution they need to go to. And then afterwards, they get to the judge. So what we did is to agree that all these services are in justice centralized systems, justice houses, where we have all these services available in the same place. And this is part of the care system. This is also part of the care system. We have managed to do systems such as public laundries. And this is done by machines from hundreds of years back. But women sometimes spend all their weekend washing clothes. I am the oldest of 6 brothers and sisters in my house. My mom was middle class and she was a teacher. And I spent my whole Saturday washing my brothers or my siblings' clothes. And this happened on a daily basis 30 years back. So we managed to do these public laundries and we care for the people they study. While this happens, we wash their clothes and we fold it, we dry it, and we give it back to them in such a way that they can free time. And this is the district system of care. And I will end with this. It's enough? No. How many blocks of care and how can we make this sustainable? Policies, well, women are the majority of the electorate. I was the first woman elected, but I will not be the last, I am sure. And these policies, once they start, they need to earn traction and legitimacy in a way that nobody sets them back. Also, in the case of Bogota in particular, we managed not only to have our plan for development, but our instrument in the long term of planning, which is the territorial ordinate plan. And this determines what the government must do in the next 15 years. Here, the system is recorded and set for a woman in Bogota, no matter where she lives, has at the maximum 30 minutes from their home, all these services, educational services, care, health, public transportation, access to services. So 30 minutes is a maximum. Today, it's around 2 hours to be able to get access to these services. And for this, Bogota proposed to have 61 new schools in the next 15 years, 45 blocks of care in the next 15 years, 5 lines for subway. And we're just building the first one now in 2021. So here we managed to insert this in the territorial planning. It's not basically a state policy for the next 15 years with budget, with infrastructure goals and service coverage. Of all this, what will we be able to leave after administration? 35 schools, 20 blocks of care, we will leave the first line of the subway built, the first half, and the second one contracted. All the children in Bogota have services insured. And one thing that we need to do, last year, there were new people coming to Bogota, migration, or many people from different regions. So we had to insure these services of 30,000 new children, but also not only for the children, for their mothers. And I would end by saying this. Now that Colombia is in presidential elections, we need to elevate this debate. How would a national system for care, what would it look like? And here we need to articulate. Bogota, for example, is giving basic income for extreme poverty. The only city in Colombia that has modest income, 200,000 pesos on average. This is not enough to get out of poverty, but this will not let them go hungry. And this is the most important thing. Today, we give that to 800,000 families that fell into poverty. This is the effort that Bogota is doing. Basic income and district system for care, the highest investment in the history of Bogota in education, both for young women and young children and women. We need to articulate this with other social inclusion policies. We need to guarantee at least half minimum wage for families that come and work in informality. And finally, I would say we need affirmative action, specific plans, such as what Bogota is doing with UN Women to finance entrepreneurship programs for women specifically, to co-finance and pay the wage for the company that hires young children or not young men and women, and at the same time have new employments of the fourth revolution for women, and young people can close these knowledge gaps and to be able to find new and better employment where they have more opportunities in a city of services such as Bogota. I would leave and end my presentation with this, and I am open to any questions you might have. First, thank you very much for following the time frame that we have. And we have a very important task before us. I would like to thank you very much for participation and shedding light on this very important topic of informality, having this structural issues. I would like to introduce our second panelist and co-national of mine. It's a great pleasure to have here the director, Marcelo Alessandro, is National Director of Economy, Equality, and Gender in the Republic of Argentina, and the first person to occupy this position. She studied in Universidad de Buenos Aires. She works in the economy field, and she has also been part of the Financiamiento University, and she has published very important books in feminist principles and saying that the future is before us. Very interesting questions, Director. It's a pleasure having you here, and thank you very much for joining us. We thank you very much for your time and your presence. From year 2020, and for the first time in Argentina, the Ministry of Economy has the first section dedicated to equality, and this generated a lot of noise. It's very surprising to see this change in our government, but it's from your perspective, what have been the advances and the challenges in making this gender issue transversal in the national budget in Argentina? And on the other hand, knowing that the government in Argentina has some specific budget resources for gender equality and care, we would like to know what are the priorities of the Argentinian government in terms of investment, and in what way, from your perspective, this can lead to a recovery with equality. This is what we're talking about today, where all the countries are pushing forward this agenda for the social economic recovery after or during the pandemic. And we want to see how this can multiply these effects in gender equality. And in this sense, what are the challenges if you are very much involved in the negotiations? In this sense, how can this be framed within this discussion? What are the challenges going forward in the context of debt? Thank you very much for joining us. Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to UN Women. I know we are all partners from Tepal here present. And Talia, it's a pleasure to listen to you. You're an inspiration to many women that want to advance in politics, and to do this, taking forward a gender agenda, not just for the matter of justice of women, but also as a tool, as you very well showed, to fight inequality, to fight poverty, and to build economically and to move forward, which is what we all want as feminist economists and those of us who work from this place.
Thank you, Luciana, also for the questions. I was listening to Alicia Barcelona's talk. I connected towards the end, but I heard the example that Claudia gave us, an exemplary case of learning more in depth and to be able to replicate across Latin America. And thinking of the fact that my area, the department that I helped start and fund, and we knew that we had a mission. It's really quite the result of the feminist struggle. We have the 8th of March, the International Day of Women, and in Argentina, the activism towards women has really made huge has grown leaps and bounds, and women have an important function in the economy, and that has to be the institutional call for Latin America and Argentina, and to open up a gender department in our politics, in our country and our government was really a milestone. And when the isolation measures began in the pandemic, one of our first activity was to present a report that was just the starting point, the gaps, the gender gaps, how we insert women into the workforce in regards to labor and what we call as productive, the industries, exports, technology, etc. A whole report where we introduce these topics. And why do I say this? It's really grown hugely. In 2020, we saw in Argentina that women's participation had really gone back 20 years. The drop, the total drop in 2002 and 2001, remember in Argentina, we had a huge crisis, economic crisis, and we went back to those levels of that time. So it was important to look at how to diagnose these issues and add it to our debate. We also had a Ministry of the Economy. We had our government that was already promoting this factor. Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner was driving this gender issues. But looking at this space with all of these indicators, and many people here talk and discuss public measures and data. Having this data is not the same as not having them, especially when we're talking about gender issues. And people think that women are complainers, because they make less money, etc. And so the general stats aren't discussed, and as the symmetry of what is happening and how burdens women, and I change the diapers, I walk the dog, I wash dishes. Those statistics show huge gender inequality, and at the beginning of the pandemic that really shook everyone up. And having this data was very important. The first program that the Argentine state established to contain the job of workers, women, had a focus on gender, on women, those who were going to suffer the impact. And we didn't even know the depth of the crisis, but of course now we see the indicators. The indicators are always lagging, right? We didn't even know what was going to happen yet, but we had a good enough diagnosis, and that information was truly important to build a response that could then improve our response to the pandemic. And of course, this has the added factor of the universal income per child. And as Claudia mentioned, this doesn't remove people from poverty, but prevents homelessness. And what was affecting homes in the most vulnerable places, of course, poverty was greatly exacerbated, but the level of homelessness was stagnant. So at least that helped us buffer a lot of what the crisis could have done. So what we did in 2020 was creating a buffer and a budget for gender. And this helped us map and organize the effort that the national government in Argentina was doing to close inequality. 50% of the budget was focused on closing these inequality gaps. I heard Claudia mention how in Colombia, women in care industries was a high level of GDP, and in Argentina, we have a 15% of GDP, and it shows us that this is the sector that really promotes our GDP the most. The sector of care is really at the top of the industry that follow, like with 13% and otherwise. But we calculated what was happening during the pandemic when there was a lockdown, staying home, all of the isolation and health measures. How did this affect the closing of schools and kindergartens? And then, okay, now the grandmother couldn't help because she was a risk factor and we had to care for her. And so that all fell on women. That was responsibility of women. Many of them had to leave the workforce. The unemployment rate for women grew much faster. We know the impacts it had on women, but I do want to mention that in 2021, when Argentina begins to recover economically, we see the same as what Alicia Barcelona mentioned and Claudia. Women come back to the workforce, but at a much slower pace than men. And from our perspective, a large part of it is linked to the crisis of care that the pandemic has put on the table in an undeniable fashion. We've seen women having a harder time coming back to the workforce. And in Argentina, we're seeing how it's harder for women to reach the levels that we saw of employment as before the pandemic. And schools are coming back and kindergartens are coming back, but all of these informal systems that were participating previously are coming back slowly. This, of course, is a topic that needs to be addressed. In Argentina, there are measures that will strengthen care, as was discussed at the beginning by Luciana, the infrastructure of care, which means that the ministry will focus expenditure on development of early childhood, kindergartens for women that have been victims of gender violence. And why did we include that? When we discuss gender policies, we look at the budget for women or the Secretariat or Department of Women. And these budgets are usually very thin. In other words, we still need to drive the collection of these resources, but the areas of infrastructure, energy, tech have a lot bigger budgets. So we focus on those areas immediately. Argentina needs to have 2.5 points of investment in infrastructure. Okay, some of this has to go to women. So we went to the infrastructure program. So the perspective of gender is not just an accounting factor, it's a guide to understand where are we going to allocate commitments to build policies that have a gender focus. We're working along two lines for economic recovery. And what we're seeing from the last years from the measurement of employment is that women have come back from the pre-pandemic levels and have overcome, we're here at the record levels of coming back to the workforce now. And this is because of the driving forces for strengthening the infrastructure for the care industry. Women that are being registered, it's a program for women that are working as maids and households. This is the worst paid jobs in Argentina. We're creating more protection. We're also looking at tech companies, infrastructure companies, energy companies, oil companies, so that when they hire and when so that they can get a stimulus for hiring women and small business enterprises owned by women. We understand that incentives like this help. And when women are included, it's much stronger. It's not that men can't do it on their own, but it's illogic to think that without women in public policies, we'll have more feminist policies. Obviously, we need more women in government. As Claudia Lopez mentioned, we need more presidents in Latin America. Right now, we have in Honduras just one woman president in all of Latin America in 2022. So now I'm not in my office, I'm in the Congress of the Nation of Argentina. Our whole economic team and we're here in the national government defending our agreement from the economic standpoint of what our relationship is with the International Monetary Fund. We inherited an enormous sum that is unpayable. If we had to pay this year, if we had to pay the interest rates this year, we wouldn't be able to do any kind of programs of any kind of transfer, any kind of incentive for employment. We would have to be operating at no cost. Right now, we're trying to create an agreement to restructure and refinance our debt. This is what we're working on at the Congress, at the level of Congress. And let me tell you that we have been participating throughout these debates and to create these agreements. And this agreement has innovation involved within the International Monetary Fund. And this agreement, this internal agreement of the vectors that need to be included to create growth for Argentina. And it's not just gender policies associated to reproductive health and rights. And these perhaps were well-intentioned, but they didn't have a focus on finance. And it was focused on now we're focusing on the care industry, the formalization of these jobs, the formal employment and workforce based on gender, economy, technology, and also there's a quantification of what our national government is doing to close this gap, this 15% of budget, which is highlighted in this chapter that we've incorporated in the memorandum agreement with the IMF. And we've also included a phrase which represents us, and it includes the fact that the macroeconomic policies and gender policies help macroeconomy. In other words, we are supporting and highlighting and holding up the fact that gender policies aren't only just and necessary to close the justice gaps and feminist factors in Latin America that we've been working on. We also understand that this is the pathway for Argentina's recovery to close the gaps of poverty, inequality, unemployment, improve employment conditions, and develop sustainable goals. And so this is a very difficult agreement. There's a lot of tension now. Government, everyone is really creating tension here, opposition as well. It's a big struggle, but we understand that this agreement will enable us
to normalize the macroeconomic situation of Argentina, and it's committing a certain conscious action that is truly focused on what we're doing in the government of Argentina, which is driving all of the gender policies to close the gaps of inequality. So thank you so much for your patience. I was here late, I'm sorry, and I think I will also have to leave early. We're gonna have a huge debate. It will last till midnight and probably the rest of the week, but we're really putting our hearts, our minds, and our commitments to promote these fundamental topics for our country. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, especially at this moment. And you've highlighted many elements of how to fund equality factors, even in this difficult time. I'm not gonna take up much more of your time. We have a panelist who is the regional director for women, and we've given you an important task. Can you sum up what the mayor, Claudia Lopez, and the minister of Argentina have stated in policies and the region for gender issues? So now we're going to have the magister from Uruguay, from Johns Hopkins University. She was also the regional director for Latin America and the Caribbean. As Luis Felipe mentioned, she's a partner in adventures. So we're going to give you the floor. And as the mayor, Claudia Lopez, mentioned, could you give us a brief summary of all of these comments in this debate? It's truly an honor to be here with Claudia Lopez and with Mercedes, who are driving these amazing tasks.
We all got together.
And without women, CARE wouldn't exist. And the IMF wouldn't have any clause of gender. So I would like to congratulate you, because you are the only ones right now who are supporting that dream that we all have, the dream of integrating gender in macroeconomy and establish these care industries, not only as an economic system, but that there is justice, as Claudia mentioned, this integration of these services in order to not re-victimize women, but give them the opportunity in everything, even in washing clothes, which is an important task. So thank you, Claudia. This shows us that the system of care, investment, public investment, etc., but it needs a voice. It needs to give women a voice in regards to what they need. We need what men to understand when they create public policies. They don't understand many of these issues, but for me, it's an honor to listen to all of your comments. This means that this dialogue with CEPAL, with International Labor Organization, and all of these other organizations that bring the best of the world to this region to drive gender-based policies that will understand women, not just in cross-cutting issues that have to do with gender, but to transform many of these policies for gender. So I think it's truly an honor to hear you, to listen to your comments, these women who are leading these important institutions and who are developing what we most need, which are these comprehensive care policies. In 2019, I had two important policies. One is to eliminate violence against women, and the best way to do so is by giving them economic autonomy. And together with that transformation that Claudia mentioned, how do we transform masculinity? How do we discuss co-responsibility? Because I remember in the pandemic when my son told me, "Mom, how do I help you?" No, you are co-responsible. You are just as responsible. And so he started bringing out the vacuum cleaner, cooking, etc. And this was the best way for him to understand that he needed to become an adult and be co-responsible. And that's the most important factor, not just for the local government, nationally, but in families as well. I believe that the combination of assets, as Luis Felipe mentioned, is truly important to combine these assets, but also the use of time, that non-paid labor, that's not a job, and the world suddenly realized that care is related to the pandemic. And so we've given the whole world that seal and that statement that without this care, there's no education for our kids, there's no health for our kids. We were all sick with COVID, and now everyone was depending on women. So we did this analysis in 16 countries of how the co-responsibility of care increased. Do you know how much? 7 minutes. In other words, women kept doing 4 times as much work without payment, carrying on their backs the whole family, and men only increase their help by 7% in co-responsibility at home. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of this fundamental change in culture that needs to happen. Thank you, Claudia, for mentioning this. It's fundamental for women to discuss self-care, for women to understand that they have to care for themselves. We have projects called Second Opportunity. These women who were abused, who didn't have access to education, who had pregnancies that weren't desirable, and who wanted to go back to the system of care. I think this opportunity needs to be given to all women. I think it's such an opportunity that you're doing in the mayor's office. And I think that we have so many issues. Of course, sometimes we need to depend on international loans that provide funding, but I ask myself, how will this have an impact on women? And sometimes I question really what the results are. And that's why microeconomy and gender issues are at the forefront. And all of this has to have a transformational effect.
We have a strategy for equality because that's my second priority of how we can increase the access to financing for women. We have more or less 118 million women that work in informality, that have had some access to microcredits, but they have not overcome poverty because unfortunately, microcredits do not get them away from poverty. So we have these women that are just away, totally forgotten by the system. So these are the women that we need to work with. 118 million women that were in informality, and thanks to programs such as what Claudia is doing, will have a change and to be able to have better work through continuous education. This is why it's so important. So we begin to talk about the loans and the different finance system, taking into account these women are not the usual women, which are the ones that have easy access to these credits. This is fundamental to speak about how these women can have access to these credits through associations, cooperations, or programs. And finally, integral systems of care. And I'm very pleased to hear what Claudia said, everything that she is saying, because we integrate the women care as a whole, transparency mechanisms and monitoring. And as you well said, for it to be sustainable, there has to be social legitimacy, political legitimacy, and established programs within the budgets for these to be public policies from the state. From now, we have the support of UN Women, and as Alicia always mentions, and CEPAL has studied quite a bit, are fundamental for us to continue working together in the region and have all our support and policies, the better politics we'll have and better opportunities for women we will have. So I hope that we continue to have women in these very important positions that change politics and change the lifestyles for women. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mariana. Very inspiring, the examples you have used and what you have rescued from the intervention of the mayor and the director. We're getting to the end of this event, and we thank very much all the people here present, more than 350 people throughout the continent and the Caribbean that have met with us. This is a conversation that we want to have with all of you to ratify these pathways to generate better financing in the area of gender equality. And what better way to close this conversation with our last panelist of the group. We will pass on the word to Ana Westmith Garcia. She's Director of Matters of Gender in CEPAL. You have the hard task of giving myself and Daniel Bittelman ideas of this coalition for Latin America and the Caribbean around financing towards development. It's quite difficult, but here's where we have the greatest potential for transformation, as we heard from Director Alessandro and Mayor Lopez. What is left before us, Anna, in terms of an agenda, a perspective for a regional agenda that can prioritize and accelerate actions for the fulfillment of all these goals that we have for the Sustainable Development Goals and everything that we heard from Alicia Wasserman and all the different people here present and all the different leaders at a regional level? Is there a space to implement systemic change for financing both public and private? Because the sector has mobilized these resources needed for this transforming change, and this path is irreversible. It's basically a one-way trip for women, and we need to change our perspective. So in the last couple of minutes, esteemed Anna, you have the last word to close the event. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you sharing, talking about financing for gender equality in the framework of sustainable development. This is a one-way trip, and this is irreversible path, not only for human beings. We also heard this from the mayor of Bogota, Claudia Lopez. It's the most intelligent thing we can do. Would it be feminist way of thinking? Well, without a doubt, it's not possible to think about sustainable development for women without the participation of women and participation in technology and all the different areas of society. So it's been a pleasure. Daniel Dieterman, also here present, Director of Economic Development for CEPAL, where we have been working in this idea that gender equality not only reinforces social policies, but also works about the macroeconomic policies and heightens the development policies. And I think that the most important thing that we were able to show in this panel is the importance of a multi-scale focus. We've had experiences that inspire us through the mayor, through the director with the district plans. We've had experiences at a national level in a sector such as Mercedes de Alessandro showed us, where traditionally we have applied a gender focus. The first director at a national level of economy and gender equality from the ministry in Argentina. And we have been also speaking about the importance of the global focus with new mechanisms for financing inequality and development. The second thing that we're showing is the tax impact with the social pact. This event has been put together by the UN system, UNDP, the regional directors, UN Women, and CEPAL with Alicia Wasserman, which is a great example So let's leave aside a COVID making this crisis even deeper for Latin America and the Caribbean, a crisis that was already present socially, economically, and environmentally speaking, with a trace of poverty that reached around 33% in the last data that we have for 2020, and 113 women for every 100 men during the pandemic have shown structural and systemic changes. And the majority of these women and men in general, but at the same time, a region that increased public expense due to transference impact, transference, non-contributive transference managed to allow us to reach 2020 with a great impact, but we're still speaking about 26% of women in the region still do not have adequate conditions. So greetings, Claudia, from the experience that you are sharing with the minimum income in the case of Bogota, which is solidarity income required by the social protection system for women. In the case of men, we're speaking about 13%. In the case of this disparity. So there are enormous structural challenges. The resources and measurements for the pandemic have concentrated in the consumption, and that's why we're calling towards a policy which is an instrument that really can redirect the financing, make these policies broader, and aim towards a transformative recovery with equality. Sustainability and equality is the great legacy of Ms. Basserman as Executive Secretary of CEPAL, and without a doubt, will require an investment without precedent to be able to do this. From CEPAL, we have mentioned this, from UN, we have mentioned this, from the countries and the policies, that these policies may be redistributive, and that's what we require. And last time we met, we agreed with Maria Noelia and the commitment of Santiago, the last regional conference for women, to implement policies that inspire us, such as these experiences that we have seen in the case of Bogota and Argentina, and what we are hearing from the different countries. We can have a counter-cyclical investment that alleviates the effects of the crisis to be able to move forward and never go back. Women never want to go back to the place where we were before the pandemic, with precarious employment, taking care of others, wasting our opportunities, and really without being able to make use of this. 4 of every 10 women in Latin America and the Caribbean do not have access to a digital ecosystem, do not have access to digitalization in the most basic level. And therefore, we require that the national efforts will go hand in hand. And this is why we're trying to finance for development. And therefore, let's remember solidarity, cooperation, and a more integrated region are all fundamental to avoid a downfall. We need to endure on our efforts, and this is what is happening today. And more coordination, not only with the social policies, but also with the financial systems, monetary systems, and commercial systems at an international level. We need to have a better coordination in the tax competence and non-economic matters such as climate change. I know that also Bogota is betting on this issue of climate change, but also this is a priority of the region as a whole. And this is what we mentioned this morning about the countries in Central America. It's very important to promote affirmative action, transversal action. This is a great lesson learned from the crisis of 2018. This is not enough. We need to put more where there is more problems. We need affirmative action in integral systems of care And many countries in the European Union, United States, are betting upon care as a central point of recovery. So this is the most intelligent thing we can do in matters of recovery, but it also requires to invest in decent work for women to participate in strategic sectors of the economy where they are not present today. For example, green economy, circular economy. These are sectors that are very much masculine, and we need more women in these intensive sectors. And of course, digital inclusion. If we're working here at hand with UN Women, the leadership of Chile that presides the Conference for Women, and we need to move forward in this investment, but also we need to move further. And we want to say that the 15th Regional Conference of Women in Latin America and the Caribbean will be the primary focus, intergovernmental focus about the rights of women and gender equality that will take place in coordination of UN Women, and all the system of the United Nations will take place in Argentina. And it's very pleasant to us to announce this forum taking place in Argentina during this week, where the president will be moving towards the creation of a national program, but also an important topic, and that's opening the licenses of paternity. It's a society issue, and the primary focus of the next conference will be a society of care, a horizon for a recovery, sustainable recovery, and with gender equality. And it will be a pleasure to have the presence of all of you and to continue speaking about this, because this is a conversation that needs to be persistent and sustainable. Tomorrow, March 8th, will be a day to recognize the legacy of women before us, to reflect, but also to take action, and to have a social and economic pact that orients the measures to preserve employment and income, a pact that pushes forward the participation of women in dynamized sectors of the economy, a social pact to have care systems at a district, national, and regional levels, and without a doubt, to ratify the motto, which is gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. Without a doubt, the horizon is society of care. This is what we're moving forward, which will be the axis for the next regional conference. And this is a very hopeful horizon. And we do not get there with empty hands. We get there with experiences, with investments, with systems of care. We get there with good practices, and without a doubt, with great challenges. That's why we say that the future will be feminist, or it will not be at all. Thank you. Well, a great way to close. I want to thank you all very much in the name of the team from United Nations. I want to thank the Mayor, Claudia Lopez, National Director, Mercedes Alessandro. You have given us great examples today with a great message that we've received during the development of today's event, but also making a great echo in many of the messages that we've shared. The chat has been on fire. We're trying to attend all the different comments, and we will commit to really reflect substantially with other colleagues from the United Nations about how we can really maintain this persistent conversation, and retaking about what Anna recently said. How can this persistence of the topic will lead us to think about mechanisms for financing that really bring forward the resources for the policies to become a reality in the cities and countries in our region. When I began my career, I think today we're talking about very different equilibrium that has to do with the systems of care and equilibrium in the roles that my colleagues very well described. With this, we'll close today's event. We thank you all very much for your attendance, for being a part of this, and we hope you have a great end of the event.